And it is the top of the hour, and we will just get started. Sherry will be helping admit people from the waiting room. So welcome, everyone. Melanie and I are so happy that you're here to join us. We are excited to give this conversation, especially in light of the times we're in, which we want to start by acknowledging that we are in times that some people have named complex, uncertain, polarizing. Some people might even think scary. And in addition to all of the hard conversations we navigate, just being humans and existing in the world with complexity, we might be experiencing some harder conversations and ones that have a little bit more weight. So while we wish we could make every conversation easy, we can't promise that today, but we do hope that in our time here together, we'll learn something more about ourselves, hard conversations, and walk away with a tool that can help you feel more prepared and confident as you navigate these hard conversations. So all of you should have received an invitation to join us on Slido. And what you're going to do with Slido, once I find it on my desktop, is answer this question about what makes a conversation hard. Differing perspectives, uncertainty, fear, conflict, emotion, the unknown, rejection. These are all things that I resonate with as well. Even as somebody who helps folks with hard conversations professionally, I still feel these as well. Alrighty. So we can see that there's some common ground in what makes conversation hard, and please continue to add to the word cloud. But we can also see that it's hard for different reasons for different people. So during our time today, we're going to talk a little bit more about hard conversations and go through some other things, including using systems thinking tools.
And before we get into like a little bit more about what we hope to do today, I want to make some space for Adria and I to introduce ourselves. And so I'll share a little bit of background about me first. I am a systems thinking specialist with Water Center. I joined the team in May of this year. Prior to my work with Water Center, I had been working in research space and doing consulting work with folks who were either trying to work with communities to understand and hold some of these deep complex conversations about challenges facing their community and how can they build a shared vision and develop some actions to improve their community overall health. I was trained as a social worker, and in the context of social work, that's how I learned about system dynamics and systems thinking. So a lot of my approach to navigating hard conversations really is informed by that social work skill set, systems thinking, and then my background in dialogue work. I am also an associate with Sustained Dialogue, and I have trained people on the Sustained Dialogue approach, which is a dialogue to action approach, which is something that has been applied in college settings, in communities and workplace settings as well. And I've also facilitated intergroup dialogues with college students, specifically looking at topics around social identity, such as race. So those are some of the background experiences that I'll be drawing from when we're thinking about what have been some helpful conversations or some helpful reflections from navigating these conversations in practice. And I also look forward to hearing a little bit more about you all and how you've navigated some of these conversations as well. And I'll hand it over to Drea to share a little bit more about her background too.
Thank you. And I always love when my colleagues introduce themselves. I feel like I learn something new every time. So I'm Alexandria Sedar, or I go by Drea. And this all started for me when I was just a little girl. I, as corny as it sounds, wanted world peace. And when I grew up, nothing changed. So I studied global security with a focus on peace and conflict studies for my undergrad, because I wanted to be a diplomat. And I thought that this was the way we would change the world, is through policy and government action. And during that time, I had the privilege of working with Engineers Without Borders, and we helped build water systems in an indigenous Ixil community in Guatemala's Western Highlands. And during that time, I also learned that the Ishio people had survived genocide, a genocide that had been supported by the United States through weaponry and other things. So I admittedly felt guilty. I felt some shame. I'm like, oh gosh, these people, I understand completely if they don't want to work with us. And I found quite the opposite to be true. In fact, I built lifelong friendships that still maintain today. And on 6 trips, worked alongside people who had survived this and whose relatives had passed away. And in that experience, I learned that one, world peace is really complex, but also the power of relationships and healing and moving forward from conflicts and things like genocide. So my scope got smaller, still pursuing world peace. I did work with youth in Ecuador. I also did work in Milwaukee, and I eventually went on to pursue my master's in sustainable peace building with a focus on public and population health. And during that time there, I had the privilege of doing dialogue work in the Milwaukee community with things ranging from the arts to police residence relations. I continued the work in Guatemala, and I also worked with Indigenous groups in the Amazon over environmental stewardship and the protection and expression of cultural knowledge. And after graduating, I worked in international education, and now I am here. I have done conflict coaching, and I'm a systems thinking specialist, all with the goal of helping us understand complexity, building relationships, and navigating hard situations and conversations towards that goal of peace. And I know there's a lot of wisdom in the room, and I can't wait to also hear what you all have to share in making this world a little bit more peaceful. So on that note, we do want to talk a little bit about how we will be doing that together here today.
So building upon what we've done so far, we do want to dive a little bit deeper into what makes conversations hard and hear from you all, create some space for us to reflect on what are the different ways in which conversations can be hard for us to experience and to navigate. And we don't want to just stop there. We want to also make sure that we're reflecting on what's been helpful to us in navigating those hard conversations. Drea and I will share some reflections from our practice. And again, we'll love to have some space and opportunity to learn from your experiences in navigating hard conversations too. We want to also make sure that we're sharing some reflections and our learnings on applying the ladder of inference in particular for navigating hard conversations. And by the end of our time together today, we hope that we enhance our collective confidence in navigating hard conversations differently in the future, hopefully inspired by the use of the ladder of inference. And as Drea and I both shared in a lot of our dialogue work and conflict management work, we both have a systems thinking approach to that. And so that's definitely going to come through very strong today. And one of the benefits of systems thinking that I've experienced in navigating hard conversations is that it allows us to move from thinking about events and responding to events to really allowing us to dig deeper and to uncover and surface what are those mental models that are so important that give rise to the systems that we're experiencing that might be causing some of the context for why things may be so hard for us to navigate, why there might be some of those different experiences in the first place. So one of the tools that we use to help us with navigating and uncovering those mental models is the ladder of inference. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today focusing in on what the ladder of inference is and how it can be a useful tool and framework for uncovering those mental models to support us in navigating conversations with that systems thinking mindset.
Yes. So the ladder of inference fundamentally is a tool and framework that explains how we go from observing and experiencing to forming beliefs that influence our actions. So how our past and present make our behavior, essentially. And then it also helps us understand how our experiences can shape our mental models, that influential point of systems change and at the iceberg, and how our mental models influence what we find important and how we interpret the information around us. So I'm going to explain the mental model, the ladder of inference, alongside an example of teaching a class. This is a personal experience I had when I taught peace and conflict studies. So the first rung of the ladder of inference is all of the information and experiences around us. So in this classroom example, it's the students, it's the whiteboard, maybe it's the feeling of the marker in my hands, maybe it's the air conditioning, maybe it's the hum of the PA system, but it's everything around us. But what we do when we go up the ladder is we start noticing certain information and experiences. In this example, I'm going to be noticing the student on their phone, which is a reality today. So then, once we notice that information, we start adding meaning. This is usually based our cultural or personal experiences. So when I'm looking at this student, the meaning I'm adding is they're not paying attention because they're looking at their phone. So the next rung of the ladder is the beliefs I develop based on that meaning. So me seeing the student on their phone, I might believe that they don't think what I'm presenting is important. I might believe that they don't think what I'm saying is important because of who I am. Or I might believe if I'm in a good mood and feeling confident that maybe there's an emergency that they need to tend to on their phone. Regardless, because of that belief, I'm going to act. So in this situation that I've been in with a student, I said, please put your phone away and pay attention. And then because of what my beliefs are, I'm going to notice certain information more in the future. So maybe when I was a first-time teacher, I didn't feel confident that the students wanted to be in my class. So I'm going to be looking for the students who are on their phone, and I'm going to be looking for the students who aren't making eye contact. Or maybe I am very confident and I'm looking for the students smiling. So what my beliefs are about myself and what I'm teaching and how I'm showing up are influencing the information I'm paying attention to. And I want to share another example that's very relevant to our conversation today. And that is what is literally going on in our head and our bodies when we face hard situations. So we're going to put ourselves in the seat of our brain. It's going to get a little technical, but it'll be helpful for our presentation today. So our brain, we are bodies existing in the world around us, surrounded by stimuli all the time. And what our eyes and ears do is they notice certain information and stimuli. And then they send that information to a part of our brain called the amygdala. It's kind of the emotional center of our brain. And it's a really important job of identifying threats and keeping us alive. The amygdala is part of the reason we don't walk in front of a car when we see it's racing down the street. It's meant to keep us safe. So the amygdala is adding meaning to the information shared to it from the eyes and ears. And then the amygdala develops a belief on that meaning. So in the case of fight or flight, the amygdala will perceive danger. And then it will send a message to another part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is kind of our command center. It sends the marching orders out for the body to do other things. So it'll engage our lungs, our nervous system. It's part of the reason when we're feeling in fight or flight or experiencing something that's emotionally intense, we will literally get hot under the collar, or our palms might sweat, we might feel like crying, our stomach drops, these kind of involuntary responses to something around us. But it also interacts with other parts of the brain. So when the amygdala and that part of the brain that wants to keep us safe identifies a threat, whether that's someone coming towards us or somebody's tone, or a situation where we feel uncomfortable, other parts of our brain go offline, including our frontal cortex, which is our rational decision-making part of our brain. That might be sometimes after a really intense situation when you're reflecting on it after you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. Where did that come from? That doesn't make any sense. And it also affects our memory and what we focus on in the future. That's sometimes why when we are in hard conversations and we try to talk about them again, we have very different ideas of what actually happened. Physically and chemically, our brain is focusing only on certain things. And then going over to this reinforcing part or this reflective part of the ladder, our brain will make a connection between what we experienced and that what gave us that emotional reaction and danger and threat in the future. And the emotional intensity and repetitive nature of these events will make those connections stronger. So if you, for example, ate a whole bag of discounted Halloween candy and got really sick, you might not be able to look at chocolate for a little bit, not speaking from personal experience or anything, but all to say, when we have these hard experiences, our brain remembers, and in an effort to keep us safe, is more likely to go down that reflexive part of the ladder and associate that with a threat. And our brain does this quickly and unconsciously, actually faster than our ability to see. And we are also doing this quickly and unconsciously every time we act. This is automatic, it's seconds.
And so when we are in conversations, that is also what's happening in some ways that will create the conditions that make us feel like the conversation in and of itself is a hard conversation to navigate. Because as Drea outlined, that same pathway that's going on in our brain is showing up in the conversations that we're having, and our brain may be perceiving that there's a threat within that conversation. And then that might switch how we are then responding and receiving the conversation around us. And that will affect how we show up, how we're listening, our ability to even hold space for that conversation. And when we're feeling this way, it makes it harder for us to navigate and move forward in a way that we may be wanting to or intend to. And so what are some of the things, like building off of what we talked about earlier in the Slido, that actually might make a conversation hard? So some of these things you noted, and I'll just like add a little bit more to that, but emotional vulnerability. If we're feeling like there might be a potential for some type of rejection to come up, or we don't want that, that can present some type of threat to our sense of safety or our sense of identity, or being in relationship with someone. Another thing that can make a conversation hard is discomfort. And so a conversation is hard, not just because it can be something that is always something that's conflict. It could be if you're at a restaurant, Andrea shared this example of like you're at a restaurant and you get your food and the food comes out and it's not exactly what you ordered. I know for me personally, I'm not really someone who's comfortable with like letting someone know that the food isn't always what like maybe was made incorrectly. So even if I know that I need to do that, like that conversation can still feel hard for me, right? And so if it's something that I'm not used to, it's because it's uncomfortable. So that discomfort, if it's something that's out of the norm, or if there's anxiety or some tension or perception that something could go wrong, that can also make a conversation hard. So hard conversations aren't just arguments, aren't just major conflicts. It can also be things that just are out of the norm for how we communicate with folks. A conversation can also be hard because something personally meaningful could be at risk. It could be your reputation. It could be a relationship you care about. If you're concerned that what we share or what is learned could present some type of change in that relationship status. It could also be about the beliefs that you hold as well. Another thing that can make the conversations hard, which we alluded to in some of the responses in the Slido, is that things are really complex. And if there's no clear right or wrong or no clear resolution, going into the unknown can be really, really, really concerning and can make us again feel like there's some type of threat, or that our brain needs to prioritize being safe, which is more in the space of what is known. So that again can put us in that position of needing to think about shutting down some of those other rational decision-making parts of our brain to just prioritizing safety. Another component that can make a conversation hard, if there are power dynamics at play, if there is some type of imbalance in the relationship, if like you're having a conversation with the manager or a supervisor, that can have some different outcomes on your job. And that can be something that can create some conflict, that can have a big impact on your life, or things that are important for your ability to provide for yourself. So that can be perceived as a threat. It can also be power dynamics and the difference in imbalance of how people are sharing. So if I'm being very vulnerable and someone else isn't sharing it to the same level, that can be a power imbalance within that. Like, how much of myself am I willing to put into the conversation? And if I'm sharing something that is more vulnerable and someone else isn't meeting at that, then that can create an opportunity for that information to be misused, and for there to be some type of harm to come back to me. So that can be perceived as a threat as well, if we're not on the same page about what we're sharing and the level of depth at which we're sharing. And another aspect that can make a conversation hard is that the conversation can require us to challenge our deeply held beliefs or mental models. And we use those mental models to make sense of the world, to navigate the world. And if we're receiving information that is confronting what we use to make sense of things, that can be very destabilizing. It can feel very scary. Again, it can promote this sense of we're entering into the unknown. And that is something that again, would encourage us to feel like we need to prioritize our safety. So not that this is an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that we can be experiencing in conversations that can make a conversation go from feeling like I'm open to this, I want to do this, to, oh my gosh, there's some type of threat that I'm experiencing, and I need to now show up in a way that's prioritizing my sense of safety or reducing that threat. And that isn't just happening in our brain, as Drea said, our brain sends some cues to our bodies. And so we can be aware of what that looks like. And so cues that we might be running up the ladder in order to promote that safety into response. where we can have an increased heart rate, our palms might become sweaty, we might notice that our hands or our feet become cold, we might have a change in our breathing pattern, we could speed our breathing up or notice that our breathing gets a lot slower. We can also have a change in our focus. So you might notice that you become hyper focused on one aspect of a conversation or something around you, or you could become kind of zoned out or and unable to focus. And so those could be some cues, again, not exhaustive, of all of the ways in which our body might be signaling to us that some action needs to take place in order to promote that safety, to reduce that sense of some type of threat or danger in the environment around us. And what I'd like for us to do now is to think just a little bit more on an individual reflective levels. What are some of the ways in which some cues that you've experienced in your body that lets you know that you're running up the ladder? We won't necessarily share these out, but just if you can think back on a hard conversation you've experienced, what are some of those cues that now when you look back on that let you know that you were running up the ladder?
And this goes back to that level of the information that we're noticing and paying attention to. So having this understanding of ourselves can help us understand when we need to go up the next rung of the ladder or invite reflection or questions into the process. You don't have to share, but you're more than welcome to share in the chat. Muscle tension, the heart rate, I get that one too, tightness in the chest. Oh, the rumination about the conversation. That is something that I experience as well. Flushed. Storytelling in my head.
Yeah, that storytelling is like that meaning making, like we're doing that work right there. It's like making the ladder even more present.
Ooh,
And the throat is definitely also important too, because that's how you communicate, right? It's one of those spaces where I notice that for me too. I will feel more tension in my throat or tightness in my throat as well.
shoulder tension seems popular. A shaky voice, a great point Melanie made, that our throat is literally where our voice comes from. So when we are feeling activated or feeling threatened, it's harder for us to express ourselves. So you can keep reflecting on this and you're welcome to share in the chat. But as our brain, so while we go up the ladder quickly and unconsciously, going down the ladder allows us to increase our consciousness and understanding. And it does this in a lot of ways, but one of the biggest ways is that it invites pause. It helps us slow down. And with that pause, it can show up in different ways. So one of them is regulating. I'm literally going to stop talking and take a breath. And breath is very powerful psychosocially, psychophysically, for bringing us from that fear, fight or flight brain back to our rational decision making. And some of the dialogue techniques I've been trained in, we actually prompt people to breathe after every time they share to bring us back to that present executive authority part of our brain. It can also be increasing our awareness to our surroundings. And maybe it's even going for a walk, but that pause invites us to regulate, to take a deep breath, to recenter. And it also gives us time in that pause to reflect. When you think about the ladder, you're noticing certain information. Maybe you start reflecting on, what information am I not noticing? Why is this conversation hard for me? What is this reminding me of? Is it bringing me back to another experience? What else do I need to know here? That space to ask questions, to understand and sit and synthesize the information you've been given. And the ladder of inference also allows us to move from reacting, that instinctual, automatic fight or flight, to responding, where we've been able to have thought and intention. So maybe we ask some of those questions, or maybe we're able to think through what we're going to do next. So this pause, this consciousness, and this understanding helps us in hard conversations through better understanding our needs and the needs of others. Again, what do I actually need in this situation to come down the ladder, to get out of fight or flight? What do I think this other person needs? What questions can I ask? So that's that clarity piece, that additional information that you might need, that tell me more, or how are you seeing this? The ladder of inference also helps us prepare for some of the potential outcomes and results of hard conversations. When we take a pause, when we go down the ladder, when we better understand why this conversation is hard and what we might need, and we start thinking about what might happen, we can go into that conversation better prepared for potential outcomes, knowing that we can't predict the future, but being prepared for some possible scenarios that we've seen based on our past experiences and knowledge. And it also helps us surface and test our assumptions about what we experience. Because the thing about the ladder is that everybody's going up it quickly and unconsciously. And we don't necessarily all notice the same things when we're experiencing the same situation. We don't always add the same meaning. We don't have the same beliefs. So the ladder is a way when we go down that we can start asking those questions of ourselves and of others. What meaning are we adding? What belief is influencing this action right now? And this can, again, help us better understand others just through purely acknowledging that everybody is going up this ladder. But there are ways that we can go through the ladder together, both physically as a tool and as a framework. And Melanie and I are going to share some of that here today. But before we do, we want to hear from you. We're going to be using Slido again. You should be getting a prompt to participate in the chat. And if you are unable to see the responses, please let me know. But you should have a box that sees that with the question, what is a hard conversation you have, are or will have to navigate, or one that comes to mind for you. And then you should start seeing people's responses. Somebody said lots. I resonate with that. See some folks typing. Advocating for yourself at work, addressing tardiness with my team, resigning from my job, teenager problems. Interviews, yes, that's a hard conversation that isn't necessarily bad. The effects of the US election, giving feedback. The election seems to be coming up. Setting boundaries is a common theme. And if you are looking at these to see the conversations other people are having, you are able to scroll. Performance, so a lot around feedback, a lot about the election. Seems like conversations with children, boundaries, advocating for yourself, compliance. Mindfulness, educating, advocating, a lot of advocacy as well. So thinking back to what Melanie shared about what makes conversations hard and what you all shared, things that are important to you, protecting people, protecting yourself, discomfort. And looking at these, again, not all of these conversations are quote unquote bad, but they are important to have. I'll give everyone just one more minute. I see some folks typing. And if you've already put your answer in, I encourage you to scroll through just to see some of the other hard conversation folks are holding, maybe conversations that are the same or different from yours. Again, to drive home that point that we all are going up the ladder and we're all navigating these hard conversations. And you can continue to put your answer in the chat, but we're going to move into some of the hard conversations that Melanie and I have helped others navigate using the ladder of inference. And I'm going to start with using the ladder of inference as a tool for group conversations. So I'm going to start by telling a little story. There is a public programming department, and this is a composite story. This is based on a real case I worked with. However, to protect the vulnerability and the space that we held, I won't be sharing their personal details, but this is informed by an actual experience. So there was a public programming department of an organization, and they developed an opinion series on a recent change in their community. And each week, they would highlight the perspectives of a certain group and their opinion on this change. So they advertised widely, they got a lot of interest, it was within the organization and within the community. But about a week before the first series started, the leader of a different department in the organization sent an email to public programming noting that an opinion series excluded a key group's perspective. So the email said, this group has been excluded historically, and this is just reinforcing the idea that this group's opinion is not important on changes in our community. And it was sent to the entire public programming team, as well as multiple other people in the organization. So the department head of public programming responded individually, saying that there was already a future event, albeit on a different topic, featuring the perspective of this excluded group. So of course we think they're important. We're giving them a whole month of programming about something else. However, with emails being exchanged, shared understanding wasn't found, and this interaction spread throughout the organization. And at the same time, a conflict arose amongst the public programming team about how the situation was handled. And when the public programming team realized that this was impacting their work in other ways, this situation became a catalyst for other different difficult conversations that were happening. It was infecting their work. I was brought in to help them work through it. So I started by having individual conversations with each team member. And in those individual conversations, I realized that there were a lot of different perspectives, but there was also shared perspectives. But the missing piece is that there wasn't an effective mechanism to communicate them. And everybody I talked to felt that when they tried to talk about this situation, things just got worse. So people were feeling disgruntled at work, feeling there was less trust, and feeling like their voice wasn't important. So after talking to everyone individually, we decided to do a 2-hour virtual ladder of inference facilitation using a platform called Google Jamboard. So I started this conversation by setting the space. Now, in facilitation in general, but especially dialogue and facilitation that touches on hard topics, setting the space is not to be skipped. In my experience, and even with this group, they're like, let's just get into it. Let's just put it on the table. Let's just talk about it. We need to hash this out. We need to get over it. We just need to be honest with each other. I hear that a lot. And as a conflict coach, that is always something that comes up as well. Just be honest with me. And the question that I always pose is, what conditions have you created for honesty, right? Because of all of those things that Melanie mentioned earlier, when we're facing hard conversations, if there's going to be consequences, if we're going to damage a relationship, that might influence my honesty. So one way we did it with this group, and what I do with facilitations around hard conversations, is we ground in a shared understanding through it defining the intention and scope of the facilitation. And this also includes acknowledging the systemic and structural factors at play. So with this group, I said, we are here to understand one another in relation to this email and the effects that it has had on our work, our team, and the organization. I do fully acknowledge that there are systemic and structural factors like discrimination and racism and oppression that play into this. And those are important to consider. And in this space, we are not able to address those and change them immediately, but we can identify next steps towards it. So for our time here together, we are focusing on understanding one another. So because they had a shared meaning and they understood the focus, it increases our likelihood of getting to those perspectives and those conversations. You also create conditions for honesty and openness through conversation agreements, individual commitment to those agreements, and allowing participants to share thoughts and perspectives anonymously. Because this group did have a close working relationship, we started with anonymous sharing. But we also started the whole meeting with a series of conversation agreements. And I asked the participants if they needed anything else to participate honest and openly. And then the important piece is that I created individual accountability. I asked each person, this was virtual, to unmute and say, I agree. And when they said they agreed to be held accountable by me, but also to hold themselves accountable to the conditions that we agreed would help this conversation move in a positive direction. And the other important piece is fostering trust, and that does take time, but there are mechanisms you can put in place to ensure a better outcome, at least in the immediate term. So we did that again through creating structures for follow through. Again, that is one of the things that I noticed talking individually to folks that I see a lot is I don't want to have this conversation again. We've had this conversation, we've tried this and nothing happened. So what's the point? Why am I going to share? Why are we even doing this? Why am I doing this uncomfortable thing? So what I did was create a parking lot was one way. So when important questions that came up that was outside of the scope of what we were discussing, we had a running list of things that were important to the organization and important to the individuals that they wanted to discuss. And I also built in time to discuss next steps. And I protected that time throughout the facilitation. And in those next steps, we defined what would be happening, who would be doing it, and when it would happen. And also, as a facilitator throughout the process, if I notice somebody, one of our agreements was you can share when you feel moved to share and not forcing others. When I notice folks being like, you haven't talked a lot, Sherry, you should talk. As the facilitator, I held everyone accountable to that agreement. So then after we all agreed and we were fine on the intention and the scope, we moved into the actual facilitation. So I created this ladder on Jamboard and we started at the top to go down the ladder. So the first thing I asked them, focusing on that action, was what was your reaction to the email? And these are the actual things that were shared. So you can see immediately that even how they saw the email varied differently amongst this group. Somebody felt guilty and they wanted to make things right. They felt embarrassed for not catching this. They were confused. Somebody else felt that this other department overstepped and overreacted. And then I asked, what beliefs about the situation influenced this reaction? Things that came up was that this organization doesn't have a strong sense of community. There's no benefit of doubt, and they assumed things about us. Somebody else said, we've added to a long pattern of marginalization. And another one was, this is an example of the hierarchical and competitive nature of our organization. So these were the beliefs that influenced how they reacted to that email. And I said, what meaning did you add to the email? So there were the words, there was what actually said, but what did it mean to you when you read that? Some folks said disapproval and appointment, said they were trying to make a statement and shame us. We hurt somebody unintentionally, and there's a disconnect between our values and our programs. And so I asked them, when you had that meeting, what did you notice about that email that led you to that meaning? Tone and word choice was the biggest one. Feelings, people noticed there were feelings. And something that wasn't even in the text of the email, but that there was various people on the email they didn't know. And later in conversation, this whole piece remained anonymous, but I invited conversation, and fortunately, everybody wanted to expand on what they wrote. So somebody said, if you had a problem, you should have come talk to me individually, not shamed me in front of the whole organization. Other people said we should have taken this more seriously. So I encouraged conversations. I asked people to share. And as they were putting Post-its up, I was careful to not say, hey, whoever put this one's wrong. So sometimes maybe a meaning or a noticing was put in the wrong spot, but I made sure to say that till after everybody got a chance to share and be heard. So after we went down the ladder, had discussions, and talked about next steps, which eventually led to this organization restructuring their mission and value statement and placing a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement on their website, I asked them to describe how they felt about the situation after going through the ladder of inference. And these were their responses. And what I noticed, because I also asked this question in the beginning, is it shifted from anger to fear to shame to things like hope. I think we can do something. I still am, somebody said, I'm still angry and think this was mishandled, but at least I think we can move forward, even though we don't agree. And I think we're going in the right direction. This group also agreed to draft the email together as a team, and they talked about what would happen if this occurred again. And the thing about the ladder of inference is not only did it help with this situation, how I have seen it help this organization and others, and even my colleagues at the Water Center have noticed, is that the ladder of inference, as we're going through these hard conversations, it's kind of like composting. You're taking the hard things and you're putting it into the soil and foundation of your organization. And from that, things can grow. And the ladder, like it literally can support a vine or flowers, can also support changes in your organization. So some of the things I've seen in this situation in my work, the supportive structures created by the ladder of inference, was a shared language to communicate perspectives, mental models, and events. Not only were people made aware of them for the first time, now they actually had words to put towards them. In this situation with the email, the department head who sent the email said, I didn't realize how big of a deal this was. I have a lot of learning to do. I think I went up the ladder too quickly. We also saw people saying that in meetings. Oh, I think we're going up the ladder here. Let's come back down. It was also creating a shared practice of inviting pause and going down the ladder. Again, that de-escalation, that pause, let's go down the ladder here. Let's take a minute. What rung are we at? And it was a framework to develop questions to increase understanding and address blind spots. So I've seen this used in the project development phase of what am I not noticing here? What perspectives aren't present? All of us are noticing this, but let's expand out and invite more perspectives to make sure that we're seeing as much of the picture as we can. And it was also a means to encourage curiosity, suspend judgment, and invite giving benefit of the doubt. So even in relationships amongst this team and other teams that I've worked with, where maybe they wouldn't love to hang out outside after work, but they still have to get work done together, they were able to use the ladder of inference to say, can you let me know what experience led to that belief? Can you tell me more? I don't understand it the same, and I want to understand your ladder, which in turn is a tool to help de-escalate and manage conflict. So now I want you to think back, and we're going to do another Slido poll to a conversation. That conversation you said that you're navigating some of these things that we put in Slido. And I want you to think to what would be structures to support you as you navigate that hard conversation. What structures would be helpful for you to navigate the hard conversation that you shared earlier today? And again, you all should have an invitation in chat to Slido. I see folks are typing. No fear of retribution, positive presupposition, a quiet space, avoiding that colleague, relevant info and data, facilitating trust, a guide, understanding systems thinking, psychological safety. I think psychological safety encompasses a lot of the things we're sharing here. Shared responsibility, training on the ladder. Sharing food, yes, breaking bread. I'm seeing a lot here about the conditions, so norms and agreements, using the actual ladder, having space. So again, that container we're holding when we're having these hard conversations, relationships, the reciprocity piece, like Melanie mentioned, understanding impact. So I also see increasing our understanding would be supportive and having mechanisms to do that. Again, investing in those relationships, open-minded and listening without defensiveness. So again, what are structures we can place? And I want you all to keep sharing because again, these are both a way for you to reflect, but also to see other perspectives on supportive structures. And part of the reason we ask this, and I asked it with other groups that I've worked with, is because this is sometimes a starting point. So with this group where we did the ladder as a facilitated meeting, I did some groundwork. I saw what structures were in place. So as you're thinking through maybe the hard conversation you want to have, or maybe doing something like this with your team, I want you to think about these structures first, and maybe that's your starting point. And now we're going to hear from Melanie's perspective.
Yeah, so I'll share a quick example of how the ladder of inference can be used in a way where if your team isn't all trained up on the ladder of inference, what are some ways that you as someone who might have that familiarity or that experience with it, how can you use the ladder as a framework to guide a conversation with your group, with your team members in a way that would still help you all navigate hard conversations? And a lot of the work that I had done previously with working with groups, we're trying to think about how can we affect the system structure and how can we promote things that are going to allow us to have the kind of culture and climate that allows us to sustain our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and commitments. And what I noticed with a lot of the groups is that they had a lot of momentum and a lot of energy and support for those DEI efforts, or diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts around 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. But they noticed as the year went on, or as time went on, there were less and less people that were committed to or available to support those efforts. And so the leadership of those efforts were often left feeling confused and wanted some support about how can we actually sustain these efforts, because we know it's important. We know the issues that were initially causing us to want to engage in this work have not gone away. We believe people are still encouraged and want to do this work, but what's going on? What are we missing? There'll be efforts to do things to support building a culture around promoting engagement, but it wasn't kind of manifesting in the way they hoped for. And so a lot of times when people would reach out to me at that stage, they were at a place of believing that this isn't a priority for our team anymore. And it was, help, we need to make this a priority again. And a lot of my work with them was trying to get them to switch from that belief and feeling like this is something that is in fact set in stone, to having us be curious about, well, in what ways is this a priority for our team? If we assume that this was, how can we set up some type of conditions for us to explore that as a group and to navigate that? And so I'll share one particular example of how this played out, but there are 3 stages that we went through that were really helpful. Creating a space for personal reflection, grounding our large group reflection, having a grounded large group reflection, and creating space for the group to respond to what we brought up as a group from that individual reflection. And that aligned with our ability to take them down the ladder of inference. And so I'll give a little bit of context to what I meant by with the creating space for personal reflection. So with this first activity that I had folks do, I had them do a personal reflective assessment, assignment, not assessment, that they could do home in a personal private space, which I think was one of the conditions that someone had outlined as being helpful to support those conversations. So having folks start in a space that did feel more psychologically safe, less stressful, for them to just have enough time to reflect on thinking about what are some of their beliefs, what are some of the meanings that they are adding to some things, for them to get a different, more deeper understanding of some of the actions that they're taking. And again, this activity was private. They weren't required to share out, but it was to set that soil, that compost that Drea mentioned earlier, that would allow us to start the conversation with that deeper reflective insight of, where am I starting at on the ladder? Like, how am I aware of what beliefs I'm bringing into how the group operates? And then as a large group, this group in particular had had some background experience in doing grounding, and they had experience and exposure to techniques that they could bring into their work together as a group that would allow them to hold space in a way that gave them the ability to have hard conversations more effectively. And I would advise this is something that is really helpful for groups that I've seen when they do have those practices and they do have an awareness and a shared practice around wanting to make space for making sure they're aware of those emotions, or they're regulating, they have that shared language around like being able to check those things for themselves and check in with themselves and do something to address what they feel is coming up in their bodies when they notice they're experiencing a hard conversation. So we leverage that and encourage the group to, again, remind themselves that these are strategies, these are tools, these are practices that could be helpful as we continue to talk about the group experience. And that, again, was really helpful, because if we're navigating a hard conversation and it's a conversation that we want to be in, if it is still feeling like a hard conversation and we're still perceiving a threat, that we may be in conflict with the desire to be in the conversation and the desire to promote our safety, right? And so those grounding techniques are helpful for helping us maintain our position, like how we want to show up in a conversation that we want to have with folks. And so during that group reflection, it allowed us to, my role was to help them identify what were some of the difference meanings that they were making amongst a group based off of the information that was available to them. Like, out of all of the information that they had, what were they focusing on? What were the differences and what people were noticing? What were the differences and the meanings that they were making? And what were the impacts of that? How did those impacts end up creating more conflict or more areas for misinterpretations or misalignment? And then then us sitting with how the difference in those meanings, how are those differences reflected in some of the system structures and some of the policies and some of the ways in which the group was being expected to show up for each other and to approach their work. And that allowed us to have some considerations for power dynamics and intersectionality that supported the group's desire to not only do work that was grounded in diversity, equity, and inclusion, like to advance it, but to also practice it internally. And they wanted to have more awareness of that. And from that space of grounding, it allowed them to have more openness to hearing, what am I missing? What are the things that I'm not paying attention to? And how can I be more accountable to that in the future? How can I make sure that I'm giving space to not only my intention, but also for the impact that I'm hearing, and to not hear that with defensiveness, to hear that with an openness and a desire to make changes to promote a better culture and climate for everyone on the team. And then the final step for that group was to, again, get into the space of responding. How do we want to do about that? What do we want to do about it? And my role as a facilitator was to support the group in reflecting on, because of these different experiences, these different meanings, these different needs that we've identified, and the different information that we've learned that we were missing initially, how can we look at how we can change our system structure so that we are able to actually have like different outcomes for the group. So one of the things I thought about was, we want people to show up intentionally and be present at our meetings, but we jump right back to back in the world of Zoom. Like, we don't give enough space for people to have a transition time where we can account for that. So they decided to think about how can they put a 15-minute buffer at the beginning of their meeting to allow people to have some time to reset, to be present. How can they have that as a way to support the intentionality of how they wanted people to show up and the supportive conditions they wanted to have people practice in their meetings to support their work. So those were some things that were helpful as we were going through that. And so those 3 stages really supported our ability to go down the ladder and to recognize where there were misunderstandings, different beliefs, and how we could, again, use that to look at how their system was playing out. And so the ladder of inference is a helpful tool. And as Drea said, there are conditions that are really supportive to allowing us to use the ladder to really receive all of the potential benefits and those different sharings that can be helpful, or those different learnings. And so when we were talking with our colleague Joan about the ladder of inference, one of the things that she pointed out is, like, if you don't have those conditions, it could be like you're putting a ladder in quicksand, right? And if it's in quicksand, the ladder, if those conditions don't support it, then you'll just not, like, you can have the tool, but it won't allow you to arrive at the condition. You won't have the structure that's needed to really allow for the ladder to fully achieve what it can achieve. And so some additional supportive conditions that were helpful for this group that I noticed was having the group composition and that muscle for hard conversation. So do they routinely come together? Is it a practice for them to want to hold conversations and to dive deep into things? It was also helpful for them to have support from leadership to carve out and to use their time to have those conversations. And so that was one way, and we can look at what do we value by how our leaders allow us to, or support, encourage us to use time. So that was one of the things that was present there. They had leadership support on different levels. They also had a willingness amongst the group and with the leadership to engage. They wanted to actively listen to each other because they wanted to find ways to be more aware of the different impacts that they may not be aware of, even if they had good intentions. They wanted to be open to those different assumptions, the information that they may be missing. Another thing that was helpful within that is that they valued the relationships that they had within the people they were working with. They wanted to make sure they weren't causing any unintentional harm, and they wanted to create an environment that supported making everyone feel like they were valued and were a part of the team. They also wanted to make sure that, that they were had this commitment to the work, commitment to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in particular. They saw that as being relevant to their personal goals of how they wanted to just show up in the world and be in relationship with their coworkers, but they also saw it as being really relevant to their ability to do work in a meaningful way and to do work that would promote the change they wanted to see in the world. So that commitment was there and supported how they were using their time. And in that, they also had a desire or a practice of being humble. They weren't trying to strive for perfection. One of the things that often gets in the way of work that I've done with groups is that they are afraid of diving deep into conversations because they're afraid of getting it wrong, afraid of doing more harm. And so if we're knowing that we're not going to be perfect, that we also have these other conditions that we care about folks, we want to be committed to doing the work to heal, to respond, to repair, that helped people be okay with being less perfect and to be open to making things a little more, assuming that we won't know everything, but we will be committed to wanting to do things together. And the last piece that was really helpful is, again, that willingness to support each other's learning and to improve, to become better supporters and coworkers to each other. So these are a lot of conditions, and I'm not saying that your team has to have all of them in order for the ladder of inference to be a helpful framework, but these are some things, as Drea said earlier, to think about how might these be things that are intermediate or short-term things that you could work with on your team, or things that you could look at for, this is something that we would want to have striving for, or this is something that we want to encourage because we see how it could have potential to help in the future.
And with that, and knowing that our time is unfortunately coming to a close, Melanie wanted to share this quote to talk about, we understand, we've shared these examples, what Melanie and I would see as successes, but we also understand that these hard conversations sometimes exist in contexts where maybe the supportive conditions aren't in place, or maybe it's not the time. However, there is power in the individual, and there is power in us using the reflective processes that come with the ladder of inference. Author and activist Adrienne Marie Brown says small is all because small is the reflection of the large. So even these small steps that we take by going down the ladder have the ability to ripple out. And the more we practice and the more it becomes part of how we show up and how we show up to our work, the bigger impact we'll have on moving these hard conversations forward in the world that we'd like to receive. And Melanie has this beautiful quote that she can share with you all.
Yeah, I read The House in the Cerulean Sea. I love that book. I highly recommend it. And this idea that sometimes our prejudices color our thoughts when we least expect them to. If we can recognize that and learn from it, we can become better people. And so the ladder of inference is a great tool to use, whether in its structure as a tool or as a framework, to support our ability to become more aware of ourselves, to become better people that can then support out in those individual ways, like Drea said, to promote the change we want to see in the world. The small is all.
And thank you all. We are willing to stay a couple of minutes later. We do know that there is time for everyone, but thank you for being in this space, and keep a lookout for our December open studio that will be coming as well. But we are, like I said, we are willing to stay here and answer any questions you may have. Again, and thank you for being here, especially now. It really warms our heart and makes us hopeful that this many of you want to move through hard conversations.